When any product is launched into a new market, and this is without regard to healthcare or consumer products or high tech, the smart thing to do is ask your customer and understand your customer's needs and requirements for success in that marketplace or for success in driving adoption. The payer world is no different. And so for us, prioritizing the evidence and defining what kind of evidence we needed to produce was really a direct result of listening to those customers. You have to meet with the medical directors of your Medicare program. You have to meet with the medical directors of the Blue plans, of Cigna, of WellPoint, of Humana, and so forth and so on. And of course, they all have the right to think quite differently. And in the case of commercial plans, they have the right to perhaps not tell you everything that they're thinking because they are, in fact, a private plan. They're not paid for by the taxpayers as with Medicare. And so there's a different level of uniformity and transparency about what evidence is required depending on the plan and depending on whether you're in the commercial plan world, or the Medicare world. The only way to figure that out and to prioritize appropriately is to ask them. And so it requires that you spend a lot of time and resources talking to people face to face and understanding what their needs are. And then again, going about with your clinical and R&D teams, planning how they're going to develop that evidence and start doing the trials. In the case of clinical validity and analytical validity, they tend to go a bit hand in hand because in order to validate your product, you actually have to be pretty darn good at the analytical validity side. However, you can't really prove clinical utility or economic utility of a product unless you've already validated it, and you can actually then prospectively test those things. So there definitely is a sequence involved. Almost always, clinical utility and economic utility, if you can tie them together simultaneously, and that's hard to do, but if you can do that, you're going to have a better payoff, a faster payoff in the end, because you're actually going to be able to prove the economic benefit of your clinical utility endpoints. It's hard to do, and we certainly didn't get that perfectly right out of the gate, but we certainly over time learned how to do that as a company in the case of this particular Corus CAD product. The two major clinical validity studies prospectively that we did in the U.S. marketplace, and they're both multi-center, are PREDICT and COMPASS. And in many cases, and this is not unique to our product, it's very true in molecular diagnostics in general, you do multiple validation studies because you need to validate your product in multiple populations. In some cases, that population may start out being where you have to start to validate because of a particular gold standard endpoint, and then you sort of work your way backwards or laterally into other populations depending on where you're going to use it clinically in your commercial population. In our case, that's exactly what we had to do. We had to start with PREDICT, which was a referred population to elective catheterization at multiple U.S. centers. And we validated it in that population and had that data published, showed that we were effective at reproducibly predicting which patients would and would not have obstructive coronary disease. However, we wanted higher negative predictive value, and we knew that we needed to validate in a population that was closer to what we would use commercially in primary care, where the prevalence of disease was also so much lower. So we set out to do a second validation study in the U.S., which is called COMPASS. The COMPASS study was done exactly in that population, a population that was not referred for elective catheterization, but has only been referred for non-invasive cardiac imaging. So this is much more similar, with a prevalence that's much more similar to a population that we actually test commercially in primary care. We did that study and had that published in the Circulation Cardiovascular Genetics journal publication, and showed that our negative predictive value was 96%. That was a fantastic outcome for us. We showed also as a secondary endpoint in that study, which was important for payers, that we outperformed myocardial perfusion imaging in that population for identifying patients who did not have obstructive coronary disease. That was an incredibly important finding, not just from the standpoint of showing that we were outperforming the usual care in these patients that we were talking to payers about, but that we could actually model the economics of what that meant in terms of the workflow of integration of Corus CAD as a diagnostic product before cardiac imaging to identify which patients should actually go there. So the COMPASS trial really became the underpinning of what we have used in the last several years to drive adoption, both within the providers in the U.S. marketplace as well as the payers in the U.S. marketplace.